Step away from that cash box and keep your hands where I can see them. I've watched people like you run these little charity scams before. Those were the first words Officer Wade Barlow ever said to me, and he said them loud enough that the folding tables stopped their rattling and the whole square went still, the way a room goes still when a glass shatters behind you. It was the second Saturday of November, one of those flat gray mornings when the cold gets underneath your coat and settles in the small of your back, and we volunteers had been blowing on our fingers between donations, stamping our feet on the frozen grass. I stood behind a card table stacked with cans of soup, boxes of pasta, and a leaning tower of instant oatmeal, wearing a faded maroon hoodie that had lost its drawstrings years ago and a paper apron somebody had laminated the night before so it wouldn't tear in the wind. In my two hands, I held a gray metal cash box with a little brass latch, and inside sat maybe $400 in neighborhood donations, ones and fives soft as cloth from being folded and refolded, a scatter of quarters, 3 or 4 checks written in careful cursive to the food bank. What Officer Barlow could not have known, what no one in that square knew, because I had spent 22 years keeping the shape of my work quiet, was that the woman he had just accused of running a scam was the United States Marshal for the district. Not a deputy. The Marshal, presidentially appointed, confirmed by the Senate, the senior federal law enforcement officer for the whole region he patrolled one small corner of. Judicial security, fugitive task forces, prisoner transport, witness protection. All of it crossed my desk before sunup most mornings, in folders and on encrypted screens, and in the low voices of deputies who called me ma'am and meant it. But that Saturday, I had left the desk behind on purpose. It was my day off, the first in a month, and I had come home, not to an office, but home, to the neighborhood that raised me, to stand in the cold and hand out groceries to families who needed them. Barlow saw none of that. I'll say exactly what he saw, because it matters. He saw a black woman in a worn hoodie standing close to a box of cash, and somewhere in the short distance between his cruiser and my table, he had already written the whole ending of the story in his head, cast me in it, and decided he liked the part he'd given himself. I have watched men do that my entire career. You learn to feel it happening, the way you feel a change in the weather in an old joint. So I did the only sensible thing there was to do. I set the box down gently on the table, in full view, the latch facing him, and laid my hands flat on either side of it, palms down, fingers spread. I had learned a long time ago, in rooms far more dangerous than a food drive, to make my hands the least interesting thing in any room a man like this was walking into. I did not raise my voice, did not step back, did not step forward. I let my breath go slow and even, the way I'd taught 100 young deputies to breathe when their pulse was climbing and their judgment was the only thing standing between everybody and a tragedy. My mind, which never fully rests, was already doing the quiet arithmetic it always does. Where the exits were, where the children were, how far the nearest adult stood from the crying that hadn't started yet but would. I noted the number on his cruiser without deciding to. I noted the name on his chest, Barlow, and the way his hand hovered near his belt like a habit he'd stopped noticing. And underneath it all, in the older and simpler part of me, I felt the particular cold that comes when you realize everything you have built, the rank, the record, the decades, counts for nothing in this exact second, because the man in front of you cannot see any of it and would not believe it if you told him. So I stood there with my hands on the table and my voice tucked away where I could reach it, and waited to see what kind of morning Officer Wade Barlow had decided we were going to have. The event was called the Harvest Table, and it had run out of that same square for 11 straight years. Miss Ada Fenwick started it the autumn after her husband passed. When the grief in her house got so loud, she said she'd rather fill a park with people than sit alone listening to it. Every November, she hauled out the folding tables and the hand-lettered signs. Hot cider, take what you need, God bless in her shaky capitals, and the little park filled with the smell of somebody's slow-cooker chili and the shrieking of children chasing each other between the booths. Grandmothers ran a standing feud over whose cornbread was superior and refused, year after year, to settle it. Men from the barber shop carried tables on their shoulders. It was the kind of gathering that makes a place feel like it belongs to the people living in it, and not to the map. I had grown up 2 blocks north, in a walk-up with a radiator that knocked all winter, and I still remembered standing in a line exactly like the one forming that morning, my small hand swallowed up in my mother's, waiting for a paper sack of groceries that carried the two of us through a hard January. You do not forget a thing like that. You spend your whole life trying to become the person on the other side of that table. Barlow had been circling in his cruiser for maybe 20 minutes before he stopped. I noticed him the way I notice everything now, automatically, a vigilance that has worn a groove in me. A slow roll past the entrance, tires crunching on the grit at the curb. A pause. A second pass, slower. Then the car eased up onto the lip of the sidewalk near the dry fountain, and he climbed out adjusting his belt with both hands and came across the grass with that heaviness some men learn on purpose, the walk that is meant to be heard before it is seen. He was big through the shoulders, mid-40s, with a jaw set like a door that had already been told no once that day and had not cared for it. I watched him pass 3 other volunteers on his way to me. Denise with the diapers, old Mr. Pruitt's nephew at the cider urn, a college girl restocking the canned corn, and I watched him not see a single one of them. His line ran straight to me, the way water runs downhill. "You hear me?" he said, close now, and rested one broad hand flat on top of the cash box, the way a man puts his hand on a thing to tell you it's already his. "Whose money is that?" "It belongs to the food bank, officer," I said, my voice level and easy, the same voice I've used in courtrooms and command posts at 3 in the morning. "These are donations from the folks here this morning. I'm a volunteer. My name is Naomi Calloway. Miss Ada, right over there in the blue coat, can vouch for me. She's known me since I was a child. And I have identification in the bag under the table, on the left, if you'd like to see it." He didn't look at Miss Ada. He didn't look at the bag. He didn't look at anything but me. And he looked at me the way you look at a problem you have already decided you are going to enjoy solving. "Funny how everybody's a volunteer when a badge shows up," he said. "I've seen this exact setup 3 times this fall. Card table, sad little sign, cash box sitting out where nobody's counting. You people pocket half of it before it ever gets where you say it's going. You people." I let the 2 words sit in the cold air between us, filing them away the way I'd file a license plate, carefully, without heat, for later. All around us the square had turned from festive to watchful in the space of a minute. A young mother pulled her son back a step and put her body a little in front of his. 2 teenagers by the cider stand had lifted their phones, screens catching the gray light. And Miss Ada, 78 years old and sharp as a filleting knife, was already gripping the arms of her folding chair and pushing herself up to come set this man straight. I kept my hands flat on the table. I kept my breathing slow. And I understood, with the clarity I have leaned on my whole working life, that this was going to get worse before it got better, and that the only thing left inside my control was whether I gave this man a single reason to tell himself afterward that I had earned it. Miss Ada reached us first, a little breathless, her cane sinking into the soft, cold grass with each step. She planted it in front of him like a stake. "Officer," she said, "that woman has been handing out groceries since 8 o'clock this morning. I have known Naomi since she was in pigtails no bigger than this. There is no scam here. There's soup, and there's diapers, and there's people standing in that line who need both, and you are standing in the way of it." "Ma'am, step back and let me do my job," Barlow said. And he said it to her almost gently, which was somehow the worst thing of all, because the courtesy he had ready for the old white woman and did not have for me made the whole thing plain, laid it out between us as clearly as if he'd spoken it aloud. He turned back to the box. "I'm going to secure this cash as evidence pending an investigation, and I'm going to need this individual to produce identification and explain exactly where these funds are headed. I offered you my identification 30 seconds ago," I said, keeping my voice even, keeping it patient, the way you keep your hands still around a frightened animal. "It's in the black canvas bag beneath the table on the left side. If you'll allow me, I'll reach for it slowly and hand it to you. Or you're welcome to retrieve it yourself, whichever makes you more comfortable, officer." That was the wrong thing to say, though nothing I said would have been the right thing, because the words were never the problem. The calm itself offended him. I recognized it landing on his face. He was a man accustomed to 2 kinds of people, the ones who get loud, whose noise he could use, and the ones who go small, whose fear confirmed him, and I was giving him neither. My steadiness read to him as insolence, as a woman who did not know her place refusing, out loud and in front of a crowd, to take the one he had picked for her. His color came up along his neck. He picked the cash box up off the table and tucked it under his arm like a football, and jerked his chin at me the way you'd jerk it at a dog. "Come out from behind there," he said. "Hands where I can see them." I came out from behind the table. I moved the way I would have wanted any deputy I ever trained to move under the eye of a gun. Slowly, deliberately. Every motion announced a half second before I made it. No surprises anywhere on my body. "I'm stepping to my right," I said quietly, for him and for the crowd both. "My hands are open. I am not armed, and I am not going anywhere." "You're going to tell me you're not armed," he said, and nearly laughed, a short breath through his nose. "Everybody's not armed, right up until they are." It was then that a little girl near the cider stand began to cry. Not a wail, just that thin, high, frightened sound children make when the grown-up world tilts on its axis and they can feel the floor move under a thing they trusted. I found her face in the crowd and smiled at her, a real smile, because I have learned across a long career that a smile from a steady adult will do more to settle a scared child than any badge or gun or uniform ever invented. "It's all right, baby," I told her, gently, across the 10 feet of cold air. "Nobody here is in any trouble. This officer is just going to check on some things, that's all. And then you and I are going to finish handing out that cornbread before it gets cold. All right." Her mother mouthed thank you at me over the top of the child's head, her own eyes wet and furious, and something in my chest went very still and very cold, because I had just knelt down inside myself to comfort a stranger's daughter while a police officer stood over me deciding, out loud, whether I was a thief. Barlow did not care for that either. He did not care for the way the fear in the square had turned and was pointing itself at him now instead of at me. He could feel the crowd's sympathy sliding, and it made him tighten, the way a man tightens when he suspects he is losing an argument he was certain he had already won. "Turn around," he said. "On what basis am I being detained, officer?" I asked. Not a challenge. I was careful of that. A question, the plainest question in the world, the one every citizen of this country has the standing to ask. "You haven't told me what crime you believe has occurred. I've given you my name. I've offered you my identification and a witness who's standing right here. I would like to understand what it is you're investigating." "Obstruction," he said, "and theft by deception. And I'll add resisting to it if you keep running your mouth. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." I turned around. I put my hands behind my back. I did it because I have carried the caskets of colleagues who did everything right, and I have sat in courtrooms and watched us convict men who did everything wrong, and I know down to the marrow how thin, how paper thin, the distance is between those two outcomes on a cold street with a frightened man holding an authority he does not understand. His hand closed hard around my right wrist, harder than it needed to. The cuffs went on, and he ratcheted them tighter than any procedure has ever called for, tight enough that I felt the steel edges bite down into the tendons, and I said nothing. I want you to understand that I said nothing on purpose, because I knew the red marks would still be there on my wrists when the cameras came, and in my experience the cameras always come. "Wade," a younger voice, behind him, uncertain and pitched too high. A second officer had come up from the cruiser, early 20s, thin through the chest, his name tape reading Pruitt. He hung back at the ragged edge of it, his eyes going from me to the growing crowd to the phones and back. "Wade, maybe we just," she said, "she's got ID right there. Maybe we run it first, before she'll get identified at booking," Barlow said, not turning around. "You want to help? Keep these people back." But young Officer Pruitt did not keep anybody back. He stood there with his hand not quite resting on anything, caught between his partner and his conscience, watching. I turned my head and found his eyes and held them, steady, for a long second, because I have learned that in nearly every bad room there is one person whose conscience has not yet finished making up its mind, and I wanted this one to remember, later, when it counted, that I had been calm, that I had asked reasonable questions in a reasonable voice, that I had smiled at a crying child while his partner tightened the cuffs past cruelty. The truth, I have found across 22 years, does not survive best in reports or on the loudest tongue. It survives best in the memory of the one person in the room who was uncomfortable and knew it. Miss Ada was on her phone now, her cane hooked over her forearm, describing the whole thing in a furious, clipped, old woman staccato to somebody on the other end. A council member, a reporter, a preacher, I never did learn who, and it hardly mattered. The two teenagers with phones had multiplied into a dozen, a loose ring of raised screens catching every angle. A man I recognized from the barber shop 2 doors down had begun narrating quietly into his own, his voice low and steady and meant for the record. Asterisk. This here is the harvest table. Been going 11 years. That lady's a volunteer, y'all. They are cuffing a volunteer at a food drive. Asterisk. Barlow took me by the elbow and marched me across the frozen grass toward the cruiser, and as we crossed the open middle of the square, in full view of all of it, he leaned his head down close to mine and dropped his voice so that only I would hear. You should have just cooperated, he said. Would have been a whole lot easier for you. I did cooperate, I said, just as quietly. Every single second of it. And I would like you to remember that, Officer Barlow. I want you to hold on to it. Because you are going to spend a very long time explaining today to people who ask hard questions, and I would like the record you carry into those rooms to be an accurate one. He didn't answer. He put one hand flat on top of my head and eased me down into the back seat, the plastic bench cold through my hoodie, and the heavy door thudded shut. Through the smeared, scratched glass, I watched Miss Ada standing in the middle of her ruined food drive, cane in one hand and phone in the other, her mouth still moving, and behind her the soup still stacked in its neat pyramids on a table that nobody was standing behind to hand it out anymore. The ride to the precinct took 9 minutes, and I counted every one of them. I counted the badge number stenciled on the dash and the 4 digits on the radio, and the exact minute the cruiser rolled off the curb, ticking it all into the ledger I keep in my head. It is a habit older than my rank, older than the star. You build the case even when you are the one wearing the cuffs, especially when you are the one wearing the cuffs, because no one else in that car is going to build it for you. Barlow rode up front with the Cashbox riding shotgun beside him like a passenger he approved of, and Pruitt sat silent in the other seat with his jaw working, and neither of them said one word to me the entire way, which suited me down to the ground. I have learned that silence unsettles a guilty man far more thoroughly than argument ever will. Argument gives him something to push against. Silence just lets him sit alone with the thing he's done. The station was a squat brick building out at the tired edge of downtown. Barlow walked me through a heavy metal door into a booking area lit by fluorescents that hummed and flickered in one corner, and behind a raised desk sat a heavy-set sergeant with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and 30 years riding low in his shoulders. His name tape read Ortiz. He looked up as we came in, took in the cuffs, took in me, the hoodie, the paper apron somebody at the scene had folded and tucked under my arm before Barlow cuffed me, the way I carried myself. And something in his face did the smallest thing, a flicker, a hairline crack of a question, there, and then smoothed over and gone professional again. But I saw it. Seeing things like that is most of what I do. What V you got, Barlow? Ortiz asked, reaching for a form without looking down at it. Theft by deception, obstruction, Barlow said, and I heard the confidence come back up in his voice now that he was on home ground. Running a fake charity table down at the square on Fenwick. Refused to identify herself. Got combative. I never refused to identify myself. I said, evenly, and I said it to Ortiz, not to Barlow. My identification is in a black canvas bag that Officer Pruitt is holding in his left hand right now. My name is Naomi Calloway. I would ask you, Sergeant, to look at what's inside that bag before this goes one step further. For everyone's sake in this room. Yours included. Ortiz's eyes moved, slow and deliberate, over to the bag hanging from Pruitt's fist. Combative how? He said to Barlow, still watching the bag. She wouldn't turn around when I told her to. She got any history in the system? You run her on scene. I didn't run her yet. Ortiz took the reading glasses down off his forehead and set them on the desk, and the small clatter of it was loud in that room. You brought her in on theft and obstruction, he said, flat, not a question at all. And you didn't run her. He held out one thick hand, palm up, toward the younger officer. Give me the bag, son. Pruitt gave him the bag, and I stood there in my paper apron and watched Sergeant Ortiz open it the way I have watched 100 people open the last door in a house they were certain was empty. First casually, one-handed, and then, all at once, not casually at all. He moved the reusable grocery tote aside. He found my worn leather wallet and set it on the desk. And underneath the wallet, in a slim credential case gone soft and dark at the corners from 22 years of riding against my hip, he found the 5-pointed star of the United States Marshal Service, and beside it, behind its little window of scratched plastic, the federal photo identification card that reads, in plain unmistakable lettering, United States Marshal, with my name printed under it, and my title, and the seal that fewer than 100 people in this entire country are entitled to carry. Sergeant Ortiz went very still and very quiet. He read it once. Then he read it again, his lips moving slightly on the second pass. He looked up at me over the top of the desk, really looked, the way you look at a person when the ground has just shifted under your understanding of them, and then dropped his eyes back to the credential a third time, because the mind simply does not want to accept, on an ordinary slow Saturday in a sleepy precinct, that the woman one of your officers just dragged in on a theft charge is the highest-ranking federal law enforcement officer in the entire district you serve. Barlow, Ortiz said, and his whole voice had changed, dropped, flattened, gone careful. Come here. What? Come. Here. Barlow came around the end of the desk, still cradling the cash box against his ribs, still wearing on his face the last stubborn residue of a man who was sure he had caught himself a live one. Ortiz turned the credential case around in his two hands and held it up, level with Barlow's eyes, so there was no missing it. The star, the seal, the words, my face on the card, and my face standing right there beside it. And I watched the color drain out of Officer Wade Barlow in real time. I want to describe it exactly, because I will remember it the rest of my life. It went the way water goes out of a wrung cloth, not all at once, but in a fast, ringing pull, the certainty draining down out of his face and his neck, and leaving behind something slack and pale and dawning, the very first raw beginning of an understanding that he was in no way ready to hold. That could be fake, he said, but there was no floor left under the words. They came out and fell straight through. It's not fake, Ortiz said quietly. I've held one of these before at a task force briefing. This is the real thing. This is the Marshal, Barlow. The Marshal. For the whole district. He looked at me then, and I will give him credit until the day I die. He did not flinch away from it, and he did not start scrambling to cover himself. He met my eyes square. Ma'am, Marshal Calloway, I'm going to take these cuffs off you right now. I'd be grateful, Sergeant, I said. And before you do, I'd ask you to photograph my wrists. He did exactly that. He didn't argue it, didn't ask me why, didn't make me explain that the record would matter later to people neither of us had met yet. He simply came around the desk, took out his phone, and photographed the raw red bands the cuffs had pressed into the skin above both my hands. Then he found the key on Barlow's belt without a word passing between them, unlocked the cuffs himself, and I brought my hands around in front of me and rolled my shoulders back and flexed my stiff fingers, and I did not rub my wrists, though they ached, because I wanted the marks left plain and visible for whatever camera came next. Barlow stood a few feet off with the cash box still in his arms, holding it now the way a child holds a thing he has just been told to put down but cannot figure out where. Young Pruitt had gone the flat white of typing paper, and I understood, standing in the buzz of those failing fluorescent lights with my hands finally free in front of me, that the hardest part of this whole day was not the part that had already happened out in the cold. The hardest part was still coming, and it was mine alone, and it was this, deciding, right now, in this room, what kind of person I was going to choose to be about it. Because I could have burned it all down. I want to be honest about that, because the honesty is the only thing that makes the rest of it mean anything. There is a version of me, a younger, harder version, the one who came up through this work back, when there were even fewer faces like mine anywhere in the building, who would have let the full crushing weight of the office fall on Wade Barlow like an anvil dropped from a roof, who would have made an example of him so total and so public that every man who ever mistook a badge for a license to decide who was a criminal on sight would feel the cold of it. I had the authority to do it. I had the record, spotless, 22 years of it. I had a square full of witnesses, a dozen phones, a wallet with a federal seal in it, and a room full of frightened men who would not have stopped me. It would have been easy. It would even, in the narrow way these things are, have been just. But I have buried too many people and prosecuted too many others to still believe that the purpose of power is to make one frightened man pay as dearly as possible for the worst 10 minutes of his life. The purpose of power, if it has any purpose worth the trouble of holding it, is to reach back and fix the thing that let the harm happen in the first place, to close the door the harm walked in through, so the next person doesn't have to stand where I was standing. And a great deal of harm had been let loose in that square this morning, in front of children, over a box of soup money. But it had not started with Wade Barlow. Wade Barlow was where it ended up. It had started somewhere much further back and much higher up, in every review that got waved through and every complaint that got filed under unfounded. And it had rolled downhill for years until it fetched up, this morning, in the hands of one certain man who thought he was doing his job. Punishing only the hands would have felt wonderful. It would have changed nothing at all. Sergeant Ortiz, I said, and I kept my voice steady and quiet on purpose, because I could feel the whole room leaning toward whatever I decided to do next. I'm not going to make a scene here. And I'm not going to quietly disappear either, so no one needs to wonder about that. Here's what I want. I want your captain notified, now, before he hears it from anyone else. I want the body-worn camera footage from both of these officers preserved and logged before a single person on this shift clocks out and goes home. I want that cash box counted and receipted in front of me, down to the last quarter, and then I want it returned to Miss Ada Fenwick at the harvest table on Fenwick Square, because there are families still standing in that line in the cold, right now, waiting on groceries that this stopped. I paused and let it land, then softened it just slightly. And I would like a phone, please. I need to call my office. People are going to start looking for me before long, and I would very much rather they hear my own voice telling them what happened than a rumor of it secondhand. Ortiz was already reaching for the phone on the desk and turning it to face me. He had been doing this work long enough to smell a fire when it was still just smoke, and long enough to know exactly which way this particular wind was going to carry it. I called my chief deputy, Ellen Park. Ellen has worked at my right hand for 11 years, and she can read the weather in my voice off about 4 words, the way farmers read a sky. I told her where I was, and then, in the flat operational shorthand the two of us have built up over a decade, I told her what had happened. No adjectives, just the facts in order. There was a silence on the line, and I knew exactly what it was. Ellen deciding, the very same way I had just decided, not to detonate. When she spoke again, her voice was pure iron gone cool. I'll have counsel and the district's community relations lead standing in that building inside the hour, she said. I'm notifying the U.S. Attorney's Office as well, as a professional courtesy, not a threat, and I'll make sure they understand the difference. Do you want the press kept out of it? No, I said. I don't want them kept out, and I don't want them fed. I just want it kept accurate. That's all. That's the only thing I want out of any of this, Ellen. Accurate. By the time I set the phone back in its cradle, the precinct captain had come down from his office upstairs, a lean, gray-haired man named Halloran, who took one look at the star sitting open on his booking desk and understood, all at once and completely, that his quiet nothing Saturday had just become the single worst day of his professional life. I will give him this. He did not try to manage me, and he did not reach for the excuses I could see stacked up behind his eyes. He crossed the room straight to me, put out his hand, introduced himself plainly, and said, Marshal Calloway, I owe you an apology, and this department owes you a great deal more than an apology, and you'll have both. Whatever it is you need from me, you have it. I appreciate that, Captain, I said, and took his hand. What I need first, before anything else, before we get to any of the rest of it, is for those groceries to get handed out today. After that's done, then you and I can sit down and talk about everything else. And we did talk about everything else over the days and weeks that followed, but not in the shape Wade Barlow had braced himself for. He spent that first long afternoon in a small room, certain his life was about to be taken apart down to the studs, and I let him sit inside that certainty for a while. Not out of cruelty. The line between them is thin, and I have watched people cross it and call it justice. I let him sit in it because I have learned that a man cannot begin to truly change until he has genuinely felt the floor give way beneath the thing he was standing on, and Wade Barlow had been standing on the certainty that he could tell a criminal on sight, and that certainty needed to fall all the way through before anything better could be built in its place. When I finally did sit down across a table from him, in a conference room with his union representative on one side of him and Captain Halloran on the other, I did not raise my voice a single time. I never do. The voice you don't raise is the one people remember. I'm not here to end your life, Officer Barlow, I told him. I could. I want you to understand that clearly, because I think you've been sitting in here telling yourself I already have. I could end your career today, with the footage alone, and no one anywhere would question it. The only reason I am not doing that is a decision I made, a choice, not a limit on what I'm able to do to you. I need you to hear the difference. I let that settle. What I actually want to understand is how you got to a place where the sight of me standing behind that table meant criminal to you before I had said one word. And I want you to know before you answer that you're going to tell me it was the cash box. And I'm going to tell you it was not the cash box. There were 3 other volunteers at that same drive this morning, standing at that same table with that same money, and you drove past every one of them. Twice. He didn't have an answer for me. Most men don't. When you set the question down in front of them plainly and refuse to help them dress it up. And in the silence where his answer should have been, I watched his face and saw at last the thing I had been looking for since the booking room. Not defiance, which is useless, but shame, which is defiance's more useful cousin. Shame you can work with. Shame means some living part of a person still knows the difference between the 2 roads and is standing on the wrong one and cannot stand the sight of his own feet. I have built more good out of a man's shame than I ever built out of his fear. What my office turned up over the following 2 weeks, working shoulder to shoulder with the department's own internal affairs unit, was that Wade Barlow had not simply had one bad morning. He was a pattern that a system had quietly, deliberately chosen not to see. There were 9 prior complaints sitting in his file. 9. Every single one filed by a black or brown resident of the neighborhoods he patrolled. And every single one closed out as unfounded by a review process that had been built, whether anyone in that building would ever say it out loud or not, to protect the officer and exhaust the citizen, to wear a person down through delay and paperwork and indifference until they gave up and went home. Twice, people had tried to take it further, to file actual civil claims, and both times they had quit when the forms and the postponements and the silence ground the fight out of them. And the 9 complaints had never once been laid side by side, never connected to one another, because connecting them was somebody's job, and that somebody had never wanted to see the picture all 9 of them made when you finally put them in a row. So I made the picture. I laid them out on a table, all 9, and I looked at what they showed. That is, in the end, the entire reason my office exists. The evidence of the day itself was overwhelming, and, thank God, undeniable. The kind of record that leaves no room for a careful man to argue his way sideways out of it. There was Miss Ada's phone, 12 unbroken minutes of it. There was the barbershop man's recording, and the teenagers, a half-dozen angles on the same 10 minutes. There was a bakery's security camera mounted across the square that had caught the whole encounter in clean, steady, uninterrupted color, time-stamped, and untouched. And there was young Officer Pruitt's body-worn camera, which, unlike Barlow's, had stayed running the entire time. Barlow's had gone dark. It had been switched off, by hand, at some point during the arrest, and that single fact turned an ugly incident into something far graver, because a camera does not switch itself off, and every person who later watched the file understood what the darkness meant. Pruitt's, though, had run straight through, and it had recorded every word spoken on that square, including the low ones. Including the words Barlow leaned his head down to whisper to me as he walked me to the car. You should have just cooperated. It is a strange and terrible thing to sit in a quiet room and hear a man convict himself in his own hushed voice on a Saturday afternoon over a gray metal box of soup money. The city's lawyers understood their position inside of about a day of watching the footage. A federal officer, the district marshal, wrongfully cuffed on camera in front of a crowd of her neighbors and their children, by a patrolman with a switched-off body camera and a buried 9-complaint history behind him. There was not a lawyer in that building who was going to carry that into a courtroom and set it in front of a jury. They came to the table fast, and they came ready to deal, and when the settlement was finally signed it came to $675,000. Here is the part 1 I'm proudest of, and the part that mattered to me more than any of the rest of it. I did not keep it, not $1. I sat down, with the city's council, with Miss Ada, and with 2 of the residents whose complaints had been buried years before and who had been made, for years, to feel as though they had imagined the whole thing. And together we built that settlement into something that would outlast everybody's anger, mine included. A large share went into a permanent endowment for the harvest table and the food bank behind it. Enough of a foundation that Miss Ada Fenwick would never again spend an October lying awake wondering whether there'd be money for turkeys and diapers come November. A portion went directly to the residents whose complaints had been thrown away. not as hush money, but as a formal, signed acknowledgement from the city that they had been telling the plain truth the entire time, which more than one of them told me, quietly, was worth a great deal more to them than the check. And the rest funded the thing I cared about most, the thing the department agreed to in writing and cannot now walk back. A rebuilt complaint review process with genuine independent oversight, and a training program in lawful stops and de-escalation, designed and audited by people who actually live in the neighborhoods being policed, not by people who only visit them in a cruiser. I took nothing for myself. The office I hold was not the thing that got injured out on that square. My neighborhood was. So my neighborhood is what got made whole. Officer Wade Barlow was not fired. I could have insisted on it. The footage would have carried it without a fight. And many people, good people, people I love and respect, sat across from me and told me plainly that he deserved nothing less, and that anything short of it was a failure of nerve. I heard them. I did not agree, and here's why. Firing him would have sent him off quietly to some other town's department a county over, with a record just clean enough to hire on, and every one of his certainties still intact and untouched inside him. And it would have taught every man on that force who thinks the way he thought exactly one lesson. Be more careful about your camera next time. That is not accountability. That is laundering. That is passing the harm down the road with a fresh coat of paint on it. And I have watched it done 100 times, and I would not put my name to it once. So instead the discipline was public, and it was real, and it stayed. He was suspended without pay. He was stripped of patrol duty. And it was made a hard condition of his ever returning to the street that he complete the very retraining his own settlement had paid for, and that he sit down, more than once, not as a photograph, but as an actual reckoning, in a room with the residents whose complaints he had never before in his life had to answer for a single word of. The switched-off body camera drew its own separate and serious consequence, on its own track, because the integrity of the record is not a small thing to me or to anyone who does this work honestly. And by the time it was finished, every officer in that building understood that it was not a small thing to the department either. Whether Wade Barlow walks out the far end of all of it a genuinely different man, I cannot promise you, and I will not pretend to. That was never inside my power to hand him. But I made certain of the one thing that was inside my power, that this time, this once, the system did not do the single thing it had always done before, every time, without fail, which was to look away. Young Officer Pruitt is the part of this whole story that I hold on to in the quiet moments, the part one take out and look at when the rest of the work gets heavy. He came to see me about a month after, out of uniform, in a jacket a size too big for him, turning his cap around and around in his hands like a wheel he couldn't stop. He told me the truth, that he had very nearly kept his mouth shut out there on the square, that he had stood there frozen and afraid of exactly what standing up would cost a man in his first years on a force like that one. I told him I already knew. I told him I had seen it moving across his face in real time while his partner was tightening the cuffs, and that the reason so much good had become possible afterward, the endowment, the training, the acknowledgments, all of it, was that in the end he had left his camera running and told the truth when the truth was asked of him. He's since applied to a mentorship program my office runs for young officers, the ones who still have a choice in front of them about what kind of law they're going to be. I signed his recommendation myself, in my own hand, because there is nearly always one person in every bad room whose conscience hasn't finished deciding which way it's going to fall, and I have learned that the entire future can come to hinge on that one person and on which way it lands, and on whether anybody was watching closely enough to catch them when it did. The harvest table came back the following November, and it came back bigger than it had ever been in 11 years. New tents against the cold, paid for out of the endowment, their white canvas snapping in the wind. A whole second block of folding tables. And Miss Ada Fenwick, 1 year older and not 1 degree less sharp, presiding over the length and breadth of it from a folding chair like a queen holding court, directing traffic with her cane. I stood behind the same kind of card table I always have, in the same faded maroon hoodie, with the same gray metal cash box sitting in front of me, and handed out soup and pasta and oatmeal and diapers to a line that ran all the way back to the dry fountain. Partway through the morning, a patrol car rolled slowly past the square, and for the length of one held breath the whole of the year before it came flooding back up into my chest at once, cold and complete. The box, the cuffs, the crying child, the thin bite of the steel. And then the officer behind the wheel lifted one hand up off it and waved at us. An easy, ordinary, unremarkable wave, the kind you give a neighbor, and drove on. And I lifted my own hand and waved back, and understood in that small exchange that this, too, this precise and undramatic thing, was part of what $675,000 and a whole great deal of stubbornness had actually bought. Near the end of that long, good afternoon, a little girl came up to my table holding tight to her mother's hand, and I realized, with a small catch in my throat, that she was the same child who had stood crying in the cold a year before, though of course she did not know me from anyone, and there was no earthly reason she should have. She looked up at me and asked, in the flat, fearless, direct way that only small children can, whether I was the one in charge of everything. I told her no. I told her that Miss Ada, over there in the good chair, was the one in charge, and that I was only a volunteer, the same as everybody else behind the tables. She took this in and turned it over with tremendous seriousness, and then asked me, very carefully, whether she might be allowed to help hand out the cornbread. I lifted the basket down off the table and set it into her two small waiting hands, and told her that helping people was the most important job there was in the whole world, more important than any badge, more important than any title anybody could ever pin on you, and that she looked to me like she was going to be very, very good at it. She took the basket from me with an air of enormous responsibility, holding it out in front of her with both arms, and carried it off down the line, working her way from person to person, and I stood and watched her go. And I thought about how the whole of it, all of it, everything I have just told you, had started with a man who looked across a card table and saw a woman standing near a box of money and decided, in the space of a few strides across the grass, that he already knew everything he would ever need to know about her. He didn't. Nobody ever does, from the outside looking in. That's the whole of it, right there. That is the one quiet lesson I have carried out of a long career and one cold November morning. And I'll give it to you plainly, the way I'd want it given to me. You almost never truly know who is standing in front of you, and that fact should never, not once, not ever, be the reason you decide how to treat them. I was the marshal that day, yes, but I was also just a woman handing out groceries in the neighborhood that raised her, and I should never have needed the star sitting in that canvas bag for the second thing to be enough all on its own. Neither should anybody else, ever, anywhere. That is the whole point. The only point in all of it worth the trouble and the heartbreak, to build, out of days exactly like that one, a world where at long last it finally, simply is.